Good afternoon. Welcome to the FDR Presidential Library and Museum, and we're so happy to have you all here in the audience, as well as those who are watching our live stream. And we're so appreciative of you being here today, of having people back on site, especially on a day when we've opened an exhibit that has long been in planning for 3.5 years. And we hope that you all get an opportunity to see it if you haven't already today, and that it inspires us all as we look forward in time to think about our past so that we can certainly make a better future. Grand words, I always like to say, but grand words don't mean that you don't need to say them. So, or be awkward about saying them for that matter. So quickly, I would like to thank, because I want to introduce the Lieutenant Governor, I'd like to thank Nancy Roosevelt Ireland, the head of our trustees, for her support throughout this, and Ann Roosevelt, chair of the Roosevelt Institute board, and all of our library trustees who have been so helpful and so engaged throughout the process. The Roosevelt Institute, Felicia Wong is here, and we certainly appreciate her support. The National Archives, of which we're a part, which President Roosevelt wanted us to be a part of the federal government, because it's the government's responsibility to ensure that this evidence, and it is evidence, and we're not talking fake news, we're talking evidence of our history and the decisions and how we got to where we are right now, is preserved, and it's available for everybody, and that it reflects everyone's history, not just the history of the few. And we are deeply committed to that work here at this library. Yeah. And those aren't grand words, those are working words, and we're all a part of that. And everyone that's here today, and we'll build better audiences, greater, not better, audiences over time. Now, I would like to introduce the Lieutenant Governor. I really appreciate the state of New York and the Lieutenant Governor, Delgado. He is certainly very familiar with this library. He is formerly represented the 19th Congressional District right here, and had the privilege of being at your inauguration in January as well. And so we're really happy to be here. I don't need to give a big introduction. He was appointed by Governor Hochul, and last summer elected to your own term. Welcome. Welcome, Lieutenant Governor.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Bill, for the kind words and for your work, for your leadership. I want to acknowledge history in this room. My first election, I came here on election day and spent most of the day here soaking up the history. I just left Columbia County, a veterans barbecue. There were a couple of World War II veterans there, 101-year-old, 97-year-old whose ship was sunk at war, survived. So you might imagine I'm kind of filled with a bit of history right now inside of me, inspired by the day and inspired to be in your company. Inspired to be at the opening of a very special exhibit, the Black Americans, Civil Rights, and the Roosevelts. I want to thank Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum for this commitment to ensuring this institution reflects the full breadth of U.S. history and the American experience. I want to thank the Roosevelt Institute and the Roosevelt family for the dedication to depicting a candid assessment of the President and First Lady in order to accurately address our past and build a more just future. I want to commend the library for centering the voices of Black community leaders, wartime service members, and the everyday Americans who refuse to accept the status quo. I want to acknowledge Arva Rice, President and CEO of the New York Urban League, historian Joe Watts, for the work that you've done in pulling this information all together. You know, in New York, we never shy away from truth-telling, from our history. We confront it, we learn from it, We do so in order to never repeat it. As Maya Angelou once said, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. There is real power in knowing and understanding our history, especially when it comes to Black history in America. Black Americans are foundational to the idea of American freedom. Our struggle is essential to America's commitment to democracy. Without the perseverance, resilience, and sacrifice, as well as patriotism of Black Americans, it is important to ask, what would our democracy look like? Black Americans have fought in every war this nation has waged since its very first one. And throughout the 19th century, Black thinkers fighting slavery, the failure of Reconstruction, and Jim Crow always maintained the notion that power needed to be shared. And freedom is participation in power. I can't take credit for that. That's Cicero. Freedom is participation in power. So the more you share power, the more freedom, the more capable we are as citizens to truly feel free and live in a free society. So it's important to understand that Black history speaks directly to the heart of America's commitment to democracy and the struggle to perfect our union. And it is critical that we make this history plain so that we may always stay grounded in our collective purpose as a nation to achieve liberty and justice for all. One of my personal heroes, Dr. King, once said, quote, "Human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Every step toward the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle. The tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals." That is what this type of exhibit is meant to reflect and is about. Those who were leaders in times of trouble, seen and unseen. Those who did the work to advance equal opportunities for all Americans, who fought to combat racism and fought to spur progress. It's critical to know their stories, that we understand our shared history, and that we pick up where we left off, continuing to advance social justice work in our nation and state. If we are truly committed to overcoming the scourge of racism and achieving racial harmony, real racial harmony in this country, genuine dialogue committed to truth and reconciliation is required. Spaces like this offer us the opportunity to pursue that path in earnest, without judgment, but in earnest. I'm proud to serve, beyond proud, to serve in a state and in a country that is committed to this work. New York is going to lead in this regard, as we always have, whether it's the right to choose, whether it's the right to vote for women, whether it's the founding of the NAACP, whether it's the LGBTQ plus community, whether it's the labor movement or the environmental movement. New York's always been out front on any number of issues that speak to the heart of progress. And this is yet again another example of that commitment. And so I just want to say thank you to everybody in this room who understands that, who's dedicated to that, who's committed to that commitment, and just appreciate every single one of you. So thanks again, and God bless you and love you.
I think we all agree with those sentiments, and I'll build on that and say that the exhibit, the full history of everyone that's in our papers and records and our exhibits in the library, they tell some tough stories. Things aren't always easy for everyone. We know that. But when you see it and you feel it in the way that you can through the real thing in our facility, in our place, in this place, in the physical nature of it, you want to tell those stories, and they could be tough and hard. But I always like to say, and people have heard me say this, and I'll keep saying it, and I'll say it, and I'll say it, that if we had the courage to overcome the Great Depression, if we could defeat fascism worldwide during World War II, then we've got to have it in us to be able to have frank assessments of our own history and look at ourselves in a civil way and engage in debate and dialogue. And that's what I hope all of this inspires, and that's what we're hoping to come out of this. And now I'd like to invite our panel up. Today we have with us Basil Smikle, who will be moderating. He's Distinguished Lecturer and Director of the Public Policy Program at Roosevelt House down at Hunter College. He's also a trustee of this library and a good friend, and appreciate all of his work. And also we'd love to welcome Arva, who's the President and CEO of the New York Urban League. We can all celebrate her hard work in terms of advocacy and activism. And Jill Watts, we very much appreciate, because she's, and I haven't mentioned this yet, was a part of the External Advisory Committee of historians and community people who helped put this exhibit together. And I want to mention this now because there are two groups I really want to single out, and that is the External Advisory Committee. Because of their role, we didn't just sit here within this building and far from the road and come up with things. We engaged with people who were experts, with people who have been in that evidence and who have been telling those stories to help us do this. And that's what you have to do. We can't just assume we know everything, because we certainly do not. And we want to learn and grow as an institution. So that External Advisory Committee was essential to this process. And and Jill is a historian, a professor emeritus of history at California State University in San Marcos. She just drove country across the entire country, so that she's even sitting here with a smile on her face is quite remarkable. And we really, we really appreciate that. But finally, before I have folks come up, I want to thank the staff of this library. The staff here, yeah, absolutely. It is an honor and a privilege to be here every day with those folks. They're remarkable, committed to the mission, from the curator to Sal, I see in the back, who greets the public every single day with a smile on his face. These folks are committed to this place, to its mission, and we could not do it without all of them. So thank you, and please join us on stage.
Got to go to the glasses. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to say that one more time. She drove all the way across country, and she came all the way from Long Island. Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to see you. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for being here. Bill, thank you so much for your leadership, the entire trustee board. It's been a pleasure on working with all of you. If you haven't seen the exhibit yet, please go and do so. It is truly, truly remarkable. There's a lot to see, there's a lot to read, but you certainly will come away very full having seen it. I just want to say, just for the personal part of the introductions, Arva, I think we've known each other maybe 20 years now. And I'm so excited for the work that you do. And thank you so much for being here, because you just had your Frederick Douglass dinner. Was it Thursday night? And who are you honoring that night?
We honored three different individuals, one of whom is the head of Fidelis Cares. We also honored the woman who, actually I'll go in opposite order. We also honored Alfred Woodard, actor and actress. And then lastly, we honored someone with the Ann S. Keel Award, and it's going to be important for this conversation today because the Keel family was involved with a lot of the civil rights movement efforts work that we did at the Urban League. And so we gave that award to Allison Obersa.
Thank you so much for being here. And Jill, I met you through your book. I had the pleasure of reading The Black Cabinet, which I know is on sale with a number of other books written by a lot of the good people that are involved in this wonderful place in the what do they call that? Bookstore, gift club. I'm losing my words today. And it's wonderful to finally meet you in person. So thank you very much. And my personal thank you to Amy Stewart Wells. Is Professor Wells here? Professor Wells, I don't mean to embarrass you. I'm sorry. But she is my colleague and mentor at Teachers College at Columbia and was on my dissertation panel. So if I would not be here without her. So thank you very much, Professor Wells. So let's get started in this conversation. Jill, I wanted to start with you. Talk a little bit about, because and I'll get to the Black Cabinet in a bit, but talk about your interest in this period in history. How did you become interested in FDR? And then I'll ask you a bit of a question about the Black Cabinet and in context of this exhibit.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for everybody to come out. And I'm so appreciative of being a part of this panel today and working with you too as well. How did I become interested in FDR? Maybe I wasn't, I don't know. Interested in Black history. And I'm really interested in that period of the Great Depression because I feel like it's a really important transitional moment. And despite all the hardships of, the war, well, I'm backing up the Great Depression, it opened up these opportunities. And so I was interested in Black history and I've done a number of projects, but maybe in terms of FDR, my grandparents, right? I always heard the stories. The one side, they couldn't stand FDR. He cut the military salaries. The other side, he saved the country, right? Mm-hmm. So in those terms, but what really led me there was this, I felt like there was this gap, and in thinking about the lieutenant governor's talk, the idea of centering Black history, it really hasn't been centered that well, I think, during the Great Depression, mm-hmm. and maybe even during the war to a degree, but it's that important moment that becomes this bridge to the civil rights movement. So. And
as you, part of the committee that put this exhibit together, what were some of the themes that you wanted to make sure were included? I guess you highlighted one just a second ago, but what were some of the themes? What went into your thinking about how to put this exhibit together?
Well, I hope when you go see the exhibit, look at that big list of people, because some of the best scholars in the country put that exhibit together. When we work on our work, we write books or articles, and it's such a solitary activity, but putting an exhibit together is collective. And that's maybe history at its best when you think about it. So I can't speak for the whole committee, but I know one of the things that was so important in the committee's mind was to make sure it stayed centered from the Black perspective, because it could easily become overwhelmed by all the activities that are going on in the New Deal and the federal government, which is predominantly white-centered. So the idea to create an exhibit that was centered in the Black experience so that Black voices could come through. And if you've seen the exhibit, you'll see so much of the documents and the speeches. It really, I think, has successfully captured that, thanks to all the folks who put that exhibit together.
Right.
So.
One of the things that really struck me are all of these names in history that we've heard. W.B. Du Bois, we've heard of A. Philip Randolph, and individuals like Eugene Kinkle Jones, who I'll talk about in a second, but they feature very heavily in the book, but also in the exhibit. What's been their role, and generally the Black Cabinet's role with FDR and in sort of advancing the civil rights mission?
Well, in terms of this period of time, right, I think that Black leadership is significant in driving the history of that narrative that time. I just think that narrative was so forgotten. So, and not you have the Black Cabinet, you have Black activist organizations, individual Black leaders, Black religious leaders, even like Father Divine, right? And they're becoming part of this kind of historical moment where they see this opening in terms of the Roosevelt administration, and they seize that moment. But what's kind of so interesting is that with the advent of the Black Cabinet is a group of federal advisors that are appointed into the FDR administration. And you never had that number of Black advisors appointed in any administration before that. And so you have this presence that you never had. That opens doors, but there's kind of an interesting blurring of the inside-outside lines because many of them were civil rights leaders previous to their appointments. So you brought the movement into the federal space and into Washington, D.C., which has been this white-dominated space, and it starts to break that down. I think that's really important.
And I want to go to Arva in a second. One of the names that I did mention was Eugene Kinkle Jones. He's very important in my life because Eugene Kinkle Jones is the former head of the Urban League, which I'll go to you, but he was also one of the 7 founders, we call them Jules, of the first Black fraternity in this country, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, founded at Cornell University, of which I am a member, as was W.B. Du Bois and A. Philip Randolph. So I see myself and my history in this exhibit too, and this is partly why it's so wonderful. But as we think about Eugene Kinkle Jones and the Urban League, you are sort of a descendant in many ways you're a part of that lineage. Talk a little bit about sort of the history of the Urban League in relation to, because it predates FDR. So in relation to all the civil rights work that has existed, occurred with the organization, through the organization from then until now with you?
Now, yes, absolutely. And I will answer that question, but I was struck, as you all heard, I'm from Harlem, but I was in Long Island today. And so I was rushing to get here. And as I was driving up and making the turn to come here, I remembered the first time that I visited this property, which was over 20 years ago. And I came with my mom, who at this time is now 76 years old. But I came with my mom, and I actually came because I like beautiful buildings. And so I was just coming to look at a mansion, right? So I was like, oh yeah, let's go up to, let's go look at the mansions. And it was when we got here and we were starting to look and see that my mother reminded me of her connection and our connection to the Roosevelts and the big impact that it had on our lives. My mom was actually a sharecropper. Her and my father were sharecroppers in Arkansas and moved north in order to get that better life and that New Deal. And so I feel very connected to the life and the story of the Roosevelts and the impact that they had on all African Americans, but particularly on my families. And so as you mentioned, the New York Urban League, the National Urban League was started in 1910 and was started just within a year of the NAACP. And the Urban Leagues always focused on economic development. And so they were the ones who were more involved and engaged in the behind the scenes kind of work of the civil rights movement. They were the ones who would be in conversations with presidents and governors and mayors, and then also later on in time with corporations, and we continue to kind of have that role. So some of my colleagues and predecessors say that the NAACP, kicks in the door, and the Urban League is often invited into the room, right? So and we get a lot of flack for that. Let's be clear, right? But that's kind of the reputation that we've had over time. And so the Urban Leagues were started in, like I said, in 1910, during not only the Depression, but in the Great Migration, right? When millions and millions of Black folks were moving to big cities. And they were going there in order to reach and to achieve as much as they could. And they got to cities that were overcrowded. The discrimination, the racism was similar, but had different looks, right? So back when it was Jim Crow in the South, it was very clear. You can only sit here, you can only sit there. Whereas in the North, it was a little bit more ambiguous, and they're kind of trying to figure that out. And so Urban Leagues were created in order to provide a place and a space for African Americans as they moved into those big cities. And so the Urban League started first, our national office is in New York, and about 10 years into the work in New York and doing work nationally, they discovered that it was important for them to have a local affiliate that was devoted to the work of New York City. So the New York City Urban League was started in 1919. When I got to the Urban League, I'm the second woman to run the Urban League, and it's a 104-year history. And so when I got to the Urban League, I was all excited because I was certain that I was going to be running the oldest urban league in the movement, and got there and found out that others had started during that 10-year gap when the national organization was here. So I was like, what? Chicago's older than us? Philadelphia's older than us. Milwaukee is older than us. But it just, if you follow the trend of migration, that's where the Urban League started. And our focus really was on helping individuals to take advantage of opportunities and to create opportunities when they weren't there. And one of the big things that we did, our initial work, was really doing data, like looking and doing research and being able to show, because it was such a segregated society that even the most well-meaning white person had no idea what the day-to-day life of a Black person was, right? And so we did studies and found out, one of the initial studies that the New York Urban League did was around tuberculosis, and found that of 100,000 people in New York City, 677 Black folks would have tuberculosis, where it was only 50 some white people. And so what did that mean in terms of healthcare and those sorts of things? And so that was really our core work initially. And then we obviously started to interact more specifically with the New Deal and started to identify some of the places and spaces where the projects that were put into place, including some of the public works projects, including the Triborough Bridge, identified and said that African Americans aren't getting the jobs in that space and place. And so we started to organize around that, and I could talk more about that.
Well, you touched on something that I do want to focus on before I go back to Jill, and ask you about, because the exhibit picks up on this, that there was a Jim Crow South and North. Mm-hmm. And could you talk a little bit about that, and to focus a little bit more on what happened in the North, because there are a lot of folks that aren't as clear about that.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. That's the place and space where the Green Book came from,
Yeah.
right? So there are ways in which in the South, as I mentioned, was very clear, right? It was colored. There was water fountains. You knew which place you were supposed to be. As I mentioned, my parents grew up as sharecroppers. When my mom moved at that point, they actually moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and my mom was at a grocery store and interacted for the first time with a white family. And the woman said, "Can I see your daughter?" And so she picks up this little girl. Back then weren't so nervous about things like that. Picked up this little girl, handed her to the woman, and the woman said, "Oh my goodness, she's so beautiful, blah, blah, blah." And my mother brushed her hand as she passed me to this woman. It was the first time she'd ever touched a white person, right? It was the first time she'd ever touched whiteness. And so when she was in the South, it was very clear that, you lived in your sharecropping area and you were over here, over to the side. But when you got to the North, there was these touches, but you had to have laws and things that were in place up in the North as well. And so things like the Green Book helped individuals to kind of give some guidelines to what they could and couldn't do.
Right. And as we think about what was happening in the country, the Jim Crow North, Jim Crow South, I often think about and to Arva's point, what's codified and what isn't. Mm-hmm. What is written versus unwritten in the law, what is done by practice. So as you walk through the exhibit, you'll see the language around farm aid and the jobs programs, housing, the GI Bill, and how that may have impacted or did impact African Americans in a disparate fashion. Could you talk a little bit about what those programs were intended to do, and then how African Americans were not included in those programs?
It's interesting because in reflecting on the New Deal and these programs, the job programs, the housing programs, the agricultural programs, Eleanor Roosevelt says, well, the New Deal basically was an economic recovery program, right? And so when you launch into the New Deal, initially it's to get the country out of the Great Depression. So they're, generating programs daily, and they're popping up all over the place. And, Washington's got tons of people coming in, right? But all these programs just go right past the Black community because the funding and the administrators are all local, and they're predominantly white, and they see the money coming to white Americans. And so everything that's being done in Washington, D.C. for the earliest part of the New Deal, it actually not only doesn't reach Black communities, actually hurts Black communities. And one of the things you have to keep in mind is that the Black community is already in a depression. When the depression hits, it just deepens it and widens it, but it deepens it. So it's the community that needs the relief the most. And Arva, what's interesting in what you're saying is that Urban League, NAACP, Black scholars, they're generating reports proving this, that it's actually getting worse in Black America, but they can't get it to Roosevelt. They can't get it to the federal level so that they can, open up the dam and hopefully get the funding.
Talk a little bit more about that resistance. So you said that it's hyper-local, right? But it's also, one of the things that the exhibit shows is how Congress was so dominated by Southern Democrats, right, at the time.
Right, and this is why Roosevelt's slow moving on so many different issues like anti-lynching and things. But once you bring somebody like Eugene Kunkel Jones in, then you start getting the data flowing. But then again, you hit the ceiling of the white administrators or the lower level program leaders. And so how do you get to Roosevelt? How do you get to Roosevelt? To get people to understand that the job programs, the agricultural relief is actually hurting Black people.
And 80% of African Americans around that time lived in the South.
Yeah. I mean, you have sharecroppers who are being kicked off the land or their land being taken out of rotation and they can't plant. And, how are they going to live? I mean, there's starvation. People are dying. And so getting that there's this belief that if you can just get it to the Roosevelts, then you can dislodge that. And that's going to happen eventually, slowly with the Black cabinet. But I think it's Mary McLeod Bethune, and you'll see her mentioned throughout the exhibit, but she opens that channel because she has this relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt.
Oh, how important is that to advancing the civil rights mission, that relationship with Eleanor?
Yeah.
It's crucial, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting because you see Eleanor Roosevelt evolving heavily in this period of time. And the White House domestic staff talk about the friendship between them that blossoms. They had an acquaintance before Mary McLeod Bethune was appointed the first Black woman to head a federal program in Washington, D.C. in 1936. And so they have this friendship that blossoms as a result because they're more in constant contact and they kind of have similar goals in many ways. Bethune talks about how they think similarly about social problems. So, but they're also both kind of political actors, if you think about it, in the game. So, but Bethune tutors Eleanor Roosevelt considerably and takes her from Eleanor Roosevelt. It wasn't just enough to be anti-racist, you had to do something about it. And I think Bethune takes her to that place.
Right. And that's an interesting point too, because we're talking about not just thinking about what to do, but actually going and doing it, actually getting the work done. I would love to hear you talk a little bit about the politics of this, because as you mentioned, working with elected officials at every level of government, and Jill raises anti-lynching. And so one of the things that I think that not only the exhibit shows, but also the film, make sure you watch the video. There's a great film as part of this exhibit also. It talks about the relationship between what happened then and now. And there's so many similarities. So as you think about anti-lynching and the challenges of getting that kind of legislation passed, what is it like trying to engage in that same advocacy today? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I didn't think you were going to land there. So
sorry.
Wow, that was.
I don't have my pilot's license, so I land. You like that?
Because as you were speaking, Jill, and then also as you were speaking, Basil, I was just thinking about just the incredible connection of these people and the importance of the connection, right? So Mary McLeod Bethune was also a board member of the National Urban League. And Eugene Kunkel Jones had served as the, what back then they called him the executive secretary, but the lead of the National Urban League. As the head of the National Urban League at that time, he was in charge of, I believe there were 40 some odd affiliates that were in place at that time. So the affiliate that I run in New York, there was one in Philadelphia, as I mentioned, there was one in LA, there's one in Milwaukee, there's one in Chicago. And so they're able to hear about what's happening at the local level of individuals who are trying to take advantage of these programs and looking and seeing, just exactly how they're missing. The intention is missing the intent. I mean, the intent is missing what actually is happening at the local level. And they're seeing how specific policies, whether it's income requirements that are or are not in place, whether it's geographic implications that are or not in place, that are keeping African Americans from being part of the process.
And it's so many points in their life, right? But whether it's education and housing, being even the ability to buy a home.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so it was almost by having somebody who had almost a focus group, right? So he was able to take this focus group of Urban League affiliates and be able to bring that inside federal government. I just think it just was incredible impacts. And so the connection that he had, even though it wasn't directly with the president at that time because of segregation and all those sorts of things, was something that the Urban Leagues have been able to keep in place over time. So the Urban League has had 8 executive directors over the course of its, at this point, I believe we're at the 115-year history. And those relationships with the presidents have increased and built over time, right? So Whitney M. Young was very close to Gerald Ford when he died. It's actually Air Force Two was sent to pick up his body and to bring it back to the United States. Vernon Jordan, as we know, had a very close relationship with Bill Clinton, and so the Urban League presidents, the Urban League presidents have always had relationships with the U.S. presidents and have always been pushing for various civil rights and various issues. As we were talking a couple days ago about this panel, I was thinking about the fact that, as much as FDR did, he never was able to push forward the lynching bills that the civil rights community was pushing so hard for. It was our central issue, our central struggle. The NAACP would hang out a flag on Madison Avenue every time that there was a lynching that happened. And unfortunately, the flag went up and the flag went up and the flag went up. And they were not able to get, they were able to get Eleanor Roosevelt to understand it's important, but we're not able to push Franklin Delano to push it in the right direction. And it was because of politics. It was because he was trying to make sure that his New Deal went forward. And so for me, I think that when I think about, well, what's the issue now? What's the thing that will not get pushed forward? And for me, it's really about the George Floyd Policing Act. And so civil rights leaders have asked and asked and asked again for that to be pushed forward. And it hasn't gone anywhere. And I think that that's the issue of our current time.
Yeah, I was, when we talked about that and you mentioned it, and I said, you gave me so much to digest there, because it is one of those things where it seems so apparent we should be able to get this done and we can't. As we think about the sort of unfinished business of the New Deal with respect to civil rights, what might be top of your mind for that? There's so many things that we could talk about, but how do you see that? What might be top of mind for you? And so as you think about what we're dealing with today?
There's just so much to say. One single issue to be at the top of, jobs and housing, all those things that the folks fought for during the New Deal still remain, sadly, on the list. And can you rank one over the other? But what I was thinking about when you were speaking about Jones is he, right when Roosevelt takes office, writes directly to Roosevelt and says, and maybe this resonates with unfinished business, he says, every time there's a crisis and the government springs into action, Black people get forgotten. And that can't happen anymore. And he argues that citizenship is granted to us by our nation, by the federal government, and that the federal government, therefore, has the moral and the legal obligation to protect each and every citizen, regardless. And it's not just protecting your civil rights, your economic rights, your voting rights, all those things, right? And he makes that argument, he kind of lays that out there and says, this is your obligation to do this. You have to do something, and it has to be broad. And I kind of think that just that bigger idea is still very important to get the nation to realize, because if you devolve too much out into local communities and state communities, then Black people will get bypassed. But if you have a strong federal government, this is a strong federal government. Roosevelt's probably happy when I'm saying that. A strong federal government that believes in the obligation to safeguard everybody's rights, then you have anti-lynching legislation that gets signed after all these years, right? And you have the other legislation that addresses police brutality and racial violence. And you have voting rights. I kind of feel like voting rights is still, it kind of has come back as important as it was in the era of Roosevelt.
Well, how much do things keep coming back? The lieutenant governor talked about learning from our history, right? Why do we see, well, not why, but we do see these issues come back over and over and over again, the unfinished business, right? And one of the things that the lieutenant governor talked about was patriotism, and I'm struck in the exhibit and thinking about the African Americans who've gone to war since this country's founding. And this question of patriotism, because you had Tuskegee Airmen, for example, going and fighting for our country, but coming back to a segregated America. So I do think about that. I do think about this sort of unfinished business. What do you focus on today? And I want to come back to Jill on the historic part, but what's top of mind for you today?
Sure, I'll answer that nationally and then locally. On the national level, the National Urban League organizes, at this point now we have 100 affiliates, and so we organize 100 affiliates for a legislative weekend that we do every year. So we go to Congress and talk a little bit about our priorities. And so our first priority was the Voting Rights Act. So the John Lewis Voting Rights Act was our first priority as we talked to our as we talked to our congressional leaders. The second was around the George Floyd Policing Act. And the third was around federal judges. And so I think that's interesting, right? And it brings us full circle in terms of some of the things that FDR was instrumental in helping to make happen. But those are the three things that we're really fighting for this year. And I think that for me, I should confess that one of the roles that I have is I am the interim chair of the city's Civilian Complaint Review Board. So we are the largest oversight entity for the NYPD, the police department, right? So justice, police accountability is always top of mind for me because it's part of the work that I do. And I also believe that it's something that's so racialized, right? And it is something that people did not believe. A brief side story, had a board chair, Jewish gentleman, wonderful, great patron of the Urban League. And we finally developed such a relationship that he asked me something I knew he'd always wanted to ask a Black friend. So he leans over to me at lunch and he says, Arva, I just have to know, what is it with you guys and Reverend Al Sharpton? Like, I don't get it. Like, right? They're like, we don't understand Reverend Al. Like, what? And I said, we Black folks believe in Reverend Al because he was there for us before we had video cameras.
That's true.
Right? And so now we can actually show it, but Reverend Al believed before we had the video camera. And he was like, oh, okay, I can kind of understand that. But I think that the experience of policing is something that is still very racialized. And so that's the reason why it's at the top of the list for me.
You mentioned judges, and that's one of the things that I wanted to ask you about. FDR's role in the Supreme Court, and that laying a foundation for so much that we can we have been able to take advantage of to this day.
Yeah, I think appointing judges who came with the new ideology, I think that's made it that's part of that bridge to the civil rights movement, because you broke open that very key agency within the government, the key branch within the government. To even hear cases, the Supreme Court previously wouldn't even hear them. So at least these folks would hear them and then make decisions that uphold and supported the civil rights movement. But I was thinking about that as we were talking over the time about this panel, and I was thinking about at the end when FDR passes away, Alfred Edgar Smith, it's Al Smith, but not your former governor. Alfred Edgar Smith was a graduate of Howard, and he headed up the largest Black jobs program in the New Deal. And he also, while he was in the government, surreptitiously wrote a column in the newspaper where he leaked all kinds of information in order to move the administration.
So
right?
he would have a fake Twitter account to me.
Yes.
Got
It's
it.
like it's that era's social media. But Smith wrote at the end of FDR's life, he said, he showed us what was to be wanted. He didn't get us there, though. And I think the Supreme Court was part of that, laying that out. So So I think that in the era, people realized there were great changes that were going to, move forward, and you had to keep walking on that path, keep taking that bridge.
And he was, I mean, if I saw the exhibit correctly, was it 5? He appointed 5 of the judges that ultimately decided Brown versus Board of Ed. And so talk a little bit about, yes, go ahead.
But that's true, but also who argues for Brown versus Board of Education, right?
Yeah.
Thurgood Marshall.
That's right.
And who's Thurgood Marshall's mentor? Bill Hasty, who's one of the Black cabinet members. And he's in the administration planting these ideas, even though they don't come to fruition and you don't, achieve the agenda. It's all planted there. And it's, those seeds are going to grow.
Mhm.
So and those doors are going to open.
And then we wanted a crosstalk as well. So Jill had some questions for me, and so I think you still do. But one of the things, Arva, that I wanted to raise with both of you actually was this notion of allies and allyship, particularly with as African Americans with white Americans that feel similarly, that want to join in this fight. We've Frances Perkins, obviously, among many, and Eleanor as First Lady. You mentioned it a little bit in terms of your board chair, but can you talk a little bit about allyship and why that's so important for today to get us past this, through this unfinished business?
Yeah, for the Urban League, allyship is essential. It's what we were based on. I mean, the Urban League was founded by a white woman and a black man who came together and realized what is it that we can do in order to advance the cause of and the efforts of African Americans. And so our efforts have always been gathering together people from different backgrounds, different experiences in order to advance our cause. And it has been at great risk at some times.
Risk.
Risk and reward, right? Mm-hmm. So Whitney M. Young, as I mentioned, was one of the national leaders of the Urban League and was there at probably the organization's largest growth since now with Mark Morial. And Whitney M. Young used to be teased and called Whitey M. Young, right? Because of the relationships that he had, the fact that he worked in city government, the fact that he worked in federal government and worked in order to move some additional things forward. And so there's some risk in it, but we can't do this work. We can't do this work without that allyship.
And you talked about the relationship that Eleanor had with Mary McLeod Bethune and how powerful was, just speak again about how powerful was that in moving the agenda? That was essential.
Yeah, I think that opens the door for Black Cabinet to get its requests to FDR, but it also opens the door for the activist organizations to get them there too. Because there's really, the line there is really fuzzy, right? Mm-hmm. And so that allyship, I think that's critical in terms of this era, and critical in terms of Eleanor Roosevelt's transformation and FDR's to a degree, I think.
Could you speak a little bit about that transformation? Was it a bigger transformation for Franklin than Eleanor?
A bigger than
larger?
I think Eleanor Roosevelt really kind of went through the transformation. The president is always a bit of a mystery, I think, and a consummate politician, right? Mm-hmm. So he's holding his cards close to the vest, as they say. And but Bethune, I think, sees him as somebody who's you can educate him and you can work with him. Mm-hmm. I think she saw him as an ally. I think she described him as a practical politician, and she talked about learning a lot about politics from him, although I have a feeling maybe he learns a lot from her too. Mm-hmm. She's very practical and strategic as well. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
And I remember in the looking through the wonderful archives here and seeing the letters that Eleanor wrote to the presidential campaign. Are you doing this? Are you talking to the clergy? Did you call so-and-so? That's phenomenal. She is very hands-on. She is very hands-on, and engaging in relationships with clergy members as well, because it wasn't just this Black cabinet. It was a sort of an ecosystem of political leadership and local leadership that were trying to collectively move this needle. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that I wanted to talk about as well, which is there's some great sort of presence of this in the exhibit, is the Black press.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
What's the role of the Black press in amplifying a lot of these messages and disparities?
Well, the black press is critical. It's critical today too.
Yes,
if you
I
think
know,
about
I'll
it.
talk to you about that.
But the black press is in the era. If you think about when you open your newspaper up and there's nothing about you in the newspaper, I mean, that's a form of censorship and a form of control. But the black press operates in opposition to that. And you have these major newspapers, the Chicago Defender, and especially Robert Van's Pittsburgh Courier, which you'll see in the exhibit. Robert Van was part of the Black Cabinet, but he was an activist and he was a newspaper publisher. And you see, again, the blending of roles here. And like I said, it was the first form of social media. It was a way to get the word out. It wasn't just, human interest stories and kind of the standard. There was an activist role for the black press, and they played it. And that was so critical. And it's the black press that says to everybody, oh, FDR has a black cabinet. And it kind of wasn't really that organized at that point, but they're announcing it. And Bethune comes in and says, we have to get organized. She makes it real.
Well, I think in politics, once we announce it, it's policy.
Oh,
I think that's what once it's announced. But it's absolutely an incredible role that is still being played to this day. We have a mutual friend in Ellie Tatum, who's at the publisher of the Amsterdam News. And could you talk about the role of the black media today, even black Twitter, and calling things to light? Because as you say, everything's videotaped now, or they don't videotape anything anymore.
Right,
It's
right.
recorded, right?
Exactly,
Right.
exactly.
See, I'm old.
Yeah, no,
I'm old school.
I mean, the role of the black press was also evident in the migration.
Yeah.
So the black press was talking about the great opportunities that were available in the North, and people started to make that movement, and so they fueled that in many ways. And black press continues to be important. It draws attention and focus on various issues. What Trayvon Martin was originally, nobody was talking about Trayvon Martin, and it was in the black press that you started to hear about it, including black radio. And so it continues to be a place and space that's so important in getting out information, getting out those stories, and making sure that they reach the mainstream. And so the support for black media is just so important, because without it, we will not be able to have our stories told in amazing ways. I wanted to say something else, Jill, about your book, which I want to thank you so much for the work and the research that you put together in order to put that together. I knew about the Black Cabinet as a concept for many years. When you think about, at least for me, when I thought about a black cabinet, I actually thought that the president had put together a group of people that were serving as advisors to him, right? But that's actually not what it was at all, right? Instead, it was people who were literally working in government and then came together in order to be able to advise, but their advice maybe got to the level of Eleanor Roosevelt, as you said before. But I think it's so important because those individuals were able to find out how government worked. They were able to find out how programs worked, and that know-how helped to fuel our work at the Urban League and through other movements around the country. So I just think that that's so important that we focus in on that as well, because these folks were literally one generation from being sharecroppers. Right? So their parents were sharecroppers, and now they're developing programs in order to spur individuals to have jobs, in order to create businesses, in order to, to create doctors and lawyers and all those other sorts of things that happened as a result of this work. And so I just think that it's really important that the role of the Black Cabinet, not just as advisors, but as technicians, as people who learned about how government works and how politics work, and the fact that these are the levers that you need to pull in order to help to make something happen, and then what couldn't be pulled as well. They still couldn't get to that lynching bill, but all the other things that, as you mentioned, laid the groundwork. And
we just got a couple minutes left, I wanted to come to you about that, because being able to move the levers of political and bureaucratic power, governmental power, is so important, because in some ways to so many, that's a hidden power. Right? But you have these individuals working in government that actually know where the money is, know what what accounts the dollars are in. And so as we look at, and that's also true with understanding where the jobs are, right? And what the new infrastructure projects are going to be, like the Triborough Bridge or the FDR Drive and so on. So these were folks who, as opposed to being appointed, they were grassroots in some respects. Right? Even though they were working in the federal government and federal employees, it was essentially a grassroots effort.
Right. And I kind of feel like one of the lessons that comes out of this era that is a legacy of this whole group, is that you need people on the inside really badly, and you need people on the outside working together. That, in fact, Lucia Pitts, who is kind of within the Black Cabinet, she's a secretary to several of the Black Cabinet members, and she says, to the criticism, oh, you're a sellout, you're in the government. She said, we need people in there because it's not just about knowing where the dollars are. It's about knowing how that whole culture works. There's a culture inside government. And once you can't see it until you get in there. And if you're constantly barred from that, how are you going to make progress? How do you know how to play that game?
We have time for just one more question I would pose to each of you. If there was one thing that you would want our audience to know about the civil rights movement then and now, perhaps even a call to action, what might that be? And we didn't pre-clear this question and answer. And I'm kind of asking it on the spot, but one thing, and I will just speak for myself, one of the things that is always evident is that Black folks are never passive in their advocacy for themselves at any time in history. And sometimes I think government tends to be, and perhaps as far back as FDR, to be somewhat paternalistic in its approach and treatment of the community versus recognizing the strength within it. And that you can have individuals that say, no, I'm going to get jobs here because we need to know how this works if we're going to help ourselves and help our folks when others won't. And that's always very striking. And I do think that that comes out very clearly in the exhibit.
One thing that I would want folks to know or think about when it comes to civil rights is that the work isn't done.
Yep.
And that you heard that we just had our annual dinner for the New York Urban League, and our theme was Renew. And at this point in period in time, after George Floyd, after there was this whole public outpouring of we need to eradicate racism, that we need to look at systemic racism, that energy is dying down, but the work is still here. And so whether it's the Voting Rights Act, whether it's the George Floyd Policing Act, whether it's all the work that we need to do around women and reproductive rights, whether it's the fact that, the transgender community, the LGBTQ community is being attacked, there's just so much more work to be done. And we need to renew our energy in order to fight the next round of the fight.
I think in terms of the exhibit, I think one of the big takeaways about then and now is how important Black history is. I think in the public realm right now, Black history is under attack. It's being removed from schools, removed from textbooks, and not just the public schools, but in colleges and universities. And I really feel like that is so primary to educating people in such a manner, not only to become good citizens, but to become active citizens in their government. I feel like Black history, it doesn't make children feel bad. It's critical to making children feel good. Mm-hmm. We introduced Black history to unite the country, not to divide it. And I think when its purpose becomes sort of obscured and then weaponized in a political battle, we have to stop that. That's so important. Bethune would be telling us, shame on you. You have to get out there and make sure that American children have an equal education, because by taking away Black history, you're giving American children an equal education. Black history is as important as math and spelling. Mm-hmm. If you think about it, because it's part of the fabric of this nation. It's part of the story of this nation. Everybody needs to have that story.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We thank you very much for your support and attendance today. Yeah?
Thank you all. I mean, we could probably sit here all afternoon. You might, after all your car drives, might not want that, but we certainly would love it. Thank you so much for being here. And just to build on those closing remarks, couldn't agree more. What we see in there are rights, one, are never rights guaranteed. And I will speak as a gay man as well, that protest and rights, Black history has informed all of those movements, all movements. And that's all movements for all of us, not just, those who haven't always been fully a part of the system, but everybody. So that's what we hope to do, is be active in our part of the role here at this library and in our piece of the puzzle. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for your support.